Now I'm going to show you how to install locks, which is a very common task once you have installed a door. So here is our newly installed door. We'll just pretend this is a front door. And typically when you have replaced just the door, you have the strike plate here for your knob or lever. And then you'll have another hole here for your deadbolt. And when that is the case, you have to match up the new locks with your existing holes. Now, since we don't have a hole here, I'm also going to show you how to drill that when you install the lock. In most cases, you'll have both of those there, so you need to line up the new locks with the existing holes on the jamb. When you have installed a door, you're going to have the strike plate for the knob and the plate for the deadbolt already in place, and you will have to match those up. Sometimes you have to drill a new one, so we're going to do that first. When these are in place, you just have to put the locks in the door so that they line up. But when you have the option to install these, the knob is typically at 36 inches from the floor. Wherever the knob is, you want that deadbolt to be 5.5 inches above it. It doesn't have to be, but some lock sets have a latch and deadbolt combo pre-installed, and those are always 5.5 inches. So when you're doing this, make it 5.5 inches. So I've got my 5.5 right there, and then I'll just put my mark right up here. Now you always want this in the middle because your lock should be in the middle of your door. So when you're installing a door that's 1 3/4 inches, this would be at 7/8. When you're installing a door that's 1 3/8 inches, the center is always at 11/16. Here's how I remember that. I go to 5/8 and just go over one more line. Or you could just eye it up. You get good enough, you can kind of pick the middle, and it doesn't have to be perfect. So we're going to drill a 1-inch hole right there. You want to have a 1-inch spade bit. Put it right there on your mark and go ahead. And it's got to be deep enough for the deadbolt to get in there. We'll just leave that there for now. We're going to put our locks in first. So when you're putting the locks in the door, you need to know where they line up. So you could put a piece of tape along here, but I just make a light pencil mark like that and like that. And those should be in the center of these holes. Close the door. And we're going to transfer these marks. So that's right there. And this one is right here. And we're going to be installing this Schlage deadbolt thumb latch combination. Now the deadbolt and the thumb latch are two separate pieces. So it doesn't really matter where they go on the door. But if they were one piece, they would be exactly 5.5 inches apart. That's why we measure it in that way. Because locks are standard in their configuration, this would be the same if you were just installing a closet lock or a bed and bath lock, so they're easily interchangeable. So now we need to know where this thing goes, how far it is from the edge of the door. We need to know the distance from here to here. That distance is called the back set, and there are two standard back sets, 2 3/8 and 2 3/4. And that's the distance from the edge of this plate to the center of the lock. Typically, residential is 2 3/8 and commercial is 2 3/4. Always check, because you could have a bunch of 2 3/4 in a house. See, here is 2 3/8 in that hole, 2 3/4 in that hole. So since this is a residential, we're going to go 2 3/8 on both of them. You could measure it with your tape measure. I prefer to use my speed square. So I put my speed square right on the line that I made. And then I mark here's 2 1/8, 2/8, 3/8 right there. I just make a little T. And there's my mark. And I do the same thing here. 2 1/8, 2/8, 3/8. So now I know I need to drill out there and there. And I also have to mark the edge of the door. I find the line that I made on the door. Put my speed square there. What I like to do is just draw a line right across, and then I find that 11/16 mark. Do the same thing here. Draw my line right across, and I go to 11/16. You'll get so good at this, you can just eye up the center. You're gonna need a standard hole saw. This is for cutting locks. The diameter is 2 1/8. Push the door up against the stop so it's nice and firm. You get the tip of the pilot bit right on your mark, and then push it in there and hold it. Get it started. Try to hold it parallel to the ground and perpendicular to the door as best you can. And we're not going to go all the way through. We're only going to drill until the pilot bit goes through. And I like to just wiggle it a little up and down and back and forth. It makes it cut easier. After you've done enough of these, you'll kind of get an idea of when the pilot bit has gone through. See, the pilot bit has gone through, so we're going to stop there, and then we're going to do the other one. Same thing, put the pilot bit on my mark, firm, even pressure. And here's why you don't want to just push it through. If you push the hole saw all the way through, it can easily blow out the other side of the door. With a real nice door, it could chip out the wood, it could chip out paint. You don't want to do that. So once you've got it through, then you turn around and go from the other side. And when you're doing this, you got to hook your foot around the door to keep it from moving. And I like to save, I keep 1 or 2 of these somewhere because sometimes you need them to patch up doors. And once I've done that, I always look through the holes to make sure they're straight through, because sometimes you drill on an angle and that can screw things up. But if you did that, there's a way to fix it. Let's suppose this hole was going up on an angle like that. Well, then I would just take my hole saw and just kind of put it like that. And just work it down like that a little bit. You know, go through, of course. Or, you know, if it was the other way, you could work your hole saw on an angle a little bit to get these things straightened out, because you have a little bit of leeway around there. When you're doing the holes on the edge for the bolts, you need a 1-inch bit. You can use the 1-inch paddle bit, or you can use a 1-inch hole saw. When you're on an 1 3/8 door, I would recommend using a hole saw, because a paddle bit can easily get away from you and punch out the side. I've done that, but either is fine. And when you're doing this, it's very important to keep the bit straight like that. You don't want to go like that, obviously. It can punch out the side. And you don't want to go up or down, because that bolt has to be in there at a 90-degree angle. And it's very important to hold the door firmly to keep that door stable. If I'm using the hole saw, I get it right on my mark. Firm pressure. Once you've drilled these holes, look in there and make sure it goes straight in. This one I drilled is going down slightly, and so is the bottom one, and that's an easy fix. Locks are very picky about alignment, and you don't want this thing going down on an angle or up on an angle. And this hole can always be a little bit bigger. So since I drilled down a little bit, I'm going to use my hole saw, and I'm just going to drill up at an angle a little bit. So you see, that did not alter the shape of this hole, but it made the inside a little bit bigger. So now this thing has plenty of room to be straight. Now we have to mortise the bolts, and I just use the same one to mark both, because they're the same. center it up and down and side to side with a very sharp pencil, trace around it. So that's where we're going to cut that one. I'm going to show you how to do this one with a chisel, and then I'm going to show you how to do the lower one with a router. When you're doing this with a chisel, it's not hard, but you want to make sure you don't go too close to the edge and blow out the side. And it also takes a lot of practice to learn how deep to go. But don't worry about getting all of this perfect. These things can often look horrible, but once the lock goes in, it covers everything. And also, sometimes you just patch around, especially if it's a paint grade door. So don't worry about doing these perfectly. I recommend getting a small chisel, a 1/4 inch chisel, and a 3/4 inch chisel. And the 1/4 inch chisel is for these curves. And don't worry about getting these curves perfect. If you just square it off, it doesn't look that bad. I'm going to start at each end and just give it a few taps because I want to mark the perimeter first. And I use my 1/4 inch to get these curves, and they're not going to be perfect. And unless you really screw these up, nobody really cares. No one ever notices. Now, if it's a nice mahogany door, be very careful. When you have a paint grade door, they're going to be painted, and this stuff can easily be fixed up if you screw something up. Now what I want to do is just make a series of cuts in here. I don't want to cut these first. I want to cut these last. By cutting this, I relieve the pressure here. And then I cut these last very lightly. And you'll realize how hard and how many taps you have to do to get these deep enough. It just takes practice. And now I'm ready to do the edges. And when you do that, you want the bevel facing in toward the center of the lock. You don't want it facing out because that's going to want to push the wood out. So here, I'll just go very light. Doing light taps. Now I basically have all of this pretty much cut. Now I want to get this down here and take some of this wood out. And again, I have the bevel facing to the inside there. I'm going about an 1/8 inch deep. Again, about an 1/8 inch deep. See how it's sticking out right here? So I know I've got to take more wood off there. If you have a really sharp chisel, you don't even need your hammer. You can just stick it in there and push it. Mine aren't that sharp. I never have great chisels. So again, you identify, like I can see it's a little high right there. I didn't get it all out. Like that. And we're almost there. I can still feel.
And even though it's important to do this well, and you should want it to look good, being able to work the chisel is the least important element of installing doors and locks. I could just hear the woodworkers saying, "Oh my God, you have no idea what you're doing. You're a complete joke." No, I'm not. I'm excellent at what I do. If you want to spend days and hours becoming an expert with the chisel, have at it. Just get good enough to install the lock properly.
So the idea is cut your border, take out the initial wood, and then test fit, and then lower it wherever you have to. Now we have a bolt that's nice and flush. And you might think, "Pete, that looks so ugly, that's horrible." But look, when this goes in, it looks great. And if you screwed something up, you could put a little filler around the edges. So now we'll do the bottom one with the router. So for the bottom, I'm using this cordless router, and this thing is fantastic. And this little lock mortising jig. And here's how this works. This is going to go on the door. So I have to set the depth of the cut. So my router bit sticks out just the thickness of the plate on that bolt. Now I take this, I center it over the hole, and I just do that by eyeing it up. And I tighten this down. And this is a special bit that comes with this jig. It has a collar on it, so it's not going to cut the jig. I stick it in and turn it on, and then I'm just going to move it around so that the collar rubs on the side of the jig. Or just around it once in each direction, and that does it. Take this off, and look how pretty that is. Perfect. So you can do either. I went for years just doing it by hand until I broke down and bought this little jig and router, and it's just awesome. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're installing your bolts. With the latch bolt, this is called the latch bolt. The curved part faces the door. If you turn it around and install it this way, it's just not going to work, and you'll figure that out once you do it incorrectly. So we're going to put this in like this. And I always recommend pre-drilling these. I have, this is called a centering bit. With some of these doors, the edges get really weird. If you don't pre-drill it, the screw starts to go in on an angle, and it can be a nightmare. And then next thing you know, you have no wood left in there. So always remember to pre-drill, and it's a lot easier. Most locks are going to give you 2 packs of screws. One pack is for the knob and the other is for the deadbolt. When it comes to putting in the actual bolts, you just use 2 of these little wood screws, and they're the same for both locks, so it doesn't matter. And when it comes to locks, all screws should go in snug. Don't crank anything down super tight, and always check things as you go along. Check for alignment. Like look here, now that that thing's in. If this thing was going like that or like that, you're gonna have a problem. So that looks good and it works. If that's not working, you did something wrong. Now for this deadbolt, it has the twist adjust for the back set. So that is 2 3/4, and then in close is 2 3/8. Most deadbolts have something here that says up or top, so you want to make sure you get that correct. This one says top, so we're going to put it in like that. And I just test it with my screwdriver. Everything's moving freely. You can't have these things sticking, binding, or too hard to turn, or a key will never work. So that all looks good. Now for the deadbolts, there's going to be 2 parts. There's the outside where the key goes in. And then there's going to be the inside with the thumb turn. And then they're going to give you 2 large machine screws. Sometimes they give you 2 sets of these depending on the thickness of the door. You want to make sure that that slot is vertical, 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And these pins are all a little bit different. You don't want to start twisting them all over the place. They need to be in the middle. So whatever it is, if you want to turn it one way and feel it stop, and then turn it the other way and feel it stop, then you want to turn it back into the middle. That's how it needs to go in. It's going to go in through this part right here, and you see it wants to go in on a slight angle. So this one has this decorative plate, and then it's got this security collar, and that goes right on like that. And these come in various configurations. And then we see our spindle goes right in there, and you want to make sure that this is aligned up and down and that your key slot is vertical. In some locks, it feels like you need 3 hands because I have to hold this in place with my right hand, obviously. I've got to hold my screws, and then whatever alignment that spindle is in, you want to have your thumb turn in that same alignment, and then it goes on. That should turn. Okay, so I want it straight up and down so I can get my screws in there. And this is the hardest part of any lock, getting all of these to line up. And I find that with deadbolts, it's a lot easier than the knobs. So if they're not going in, you might have to turn this thing or look outside and make sure your outside didn't get twisted, because these things have to line up and they have to go in easily. You cannot force these things. These things get cross-threaded, you can destroy the lock. I would say, especially when you're doing your first ones, use a screwdriver, don't use a drill. If they're not going in smoothly and easily, take it out and just kind of move everything around, because locks need to be aligned. And when you get real good at them, you figure it out, you get the touch. And I did not crank that down, it's just a little bit snug. It's got a nice action on it. So you'll find that locks have a happy place. So let me do this. Let me back this off. See how much that can move up and down? Now imagine, and it can also move side to side a little bit. These things move around. There, see how it's just nice and easy action? Once you find that easy action, hold this with your thumb and snug it down. And that's where the lock wants to be. I'm gonna push this thing down so the lock is out of alignment. And then I'm gonna crank this screw down. And look at that. It doesn't even wanna turn now. I'm not gonna force it because I don't wanna break it. I cannot even turn this thing because everything's out of alignment. The lock's going, ugh! So we're gonna back it off. There's the happy place. Now, I'm holding the lock on the other side with my fingers and I'm pushing on it with my thumb. Now I'm just gonna snug these down. Don't want them loose, but you don't want to crank them. Now look at that. Perfect. We'll do the same thing down below. But if this was just a regular lever lock like this, I'd put in, both sides, put in my screws, and we're done. But we have a thumb latch, so there's one more hole to drill. Now my thumb latch is going to go here, so I have to drill this hole to go through here. Now the newer models, this piece moves, which makes it a lot easier. On older models, this piece is fixed. And if you look in the instructions, it'll tell you the distance between here and here. And that's where you have to drill your holes. If I put that thing in the center, it's 9 inches. So I know 9 inches from the center of my hole, that's where that has to go. The way I usually do it is just put this through and then just eye it up. Since I know I have plenty of room for error, I just make a mark down there. Whatever your back set is, that's how far you're gonna go. So we know this is 2 3/8. So I make a mark here at 2 3/8, and then I double check it so I know that thing is gonna fit in there. However big this is, you want your hole to be bigger. Don't try to match this exactly, because if this gets too tight, it's not gonna work. So I typically use a 3/8 bit on here. And keep in mind that this screw is gonna go in through the other side, and then this cap is gonna go over the screw. So you can't make your hole bigger than this cap, but you've got plenty of wiggle room there if you screw anything up. And also you wanna be careful you don't blow out the other side of the door, but we've got enough wiggle room with this cap. But if you aren't sure, use a 3/8 spade bit so the little tip can go through there first, and then once that comes out, then you can turn around and go through the other side. See how I can move this around, makes it very easy. And test your latch. I'm gonna push down on the handle real hard. This sticks, see, it's not going well. But when I relieve the pressure of the handle, it goes very easy. So once I have this in place, I put in this screw, and there's some sort of washer that comes with it as well. Get the lock in its happy place and just snug this down. Once that's working, then you put your knob or lever on, and that comes with 2 machine screws. And these can be the hardest things to get in. It depends on the lock. These really have to be lined up well. I find that the Schlage is much easier to install than the Quickset, and the M-Tech and Baldwin are the most difficult. You have to get these screws in deep enough because your drill will hit the edge of this knob. And if those are not going in easily, take it out, because you don't want to cross thread those and strip them. Again, check everything. And it's very common to screw up this hole. If so, just put your bit in and just make it a little bigger in either direction. And then you have this cap that snaps on. There. Now let's see how well our holes line up. That engages. This does not. So now we have to figure out where it's going. Sometimes I'll just push it in real hard or pull it to see if it's just an alignment issue this way. If I pull it back a little bit, it goes right in. You always get the knob in first because that shuts the door and puts it in its place. And once it's in its place, then you adjust this thing. So when I shut my door, it doesn't latch. But when I pull it toward me a little bit, this latches. So that means it's going too far forward. So that means I just need to make this hole a little bit bigger. Before I do anything, I just want to check this as well. I put my deadbolt out and I just make a couple of light marks right around it. See how that lines up? It looks like it's a little low, just a tad low. So here's the mark I just made and it goes right to there. So the bolt could be hitting there. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna take out this section right here. We're gonna do that with the chisel. And this all gets covered up by the plate, so don't worry about what you have to do to that. When you're chiseling pieces like this, you don't wanna just put your chisel in there and whack it, because that could knock out all of this. You wanna cut out little pieces of wood at a time. So I'm gonna start right here. We're gonna go like this. Just make little cuts. I can even use my small chisel and we're just taking out little pieces at a time. And sometimes when you're doing locks like this, you have to test these things 10 or 20 times. And look at that. Nice and easy. It shouldn't be rubbing anything. You shouldn't have to push it, pull it, lift it, tug it. It should just turn nice and easy. So now we know that that works. We're going to put in the plate. Now this plate is nice size. It's big. It's much bigger than the bolt. Some of these plates are just slightly bigger than the bolt. And it's really hard to line them up. So as you install locks, remove locks, when you get extra parts, especially when you get big plates like this, keep them because it really helps to have them. Because sometimes you get a plate that's just too small and you need a bigger one, so it's good to have a stash. So we know our bolt's going in here, so we're just going to kind of center it right on there. And then we'll trace it. And some deadbolts have two parts. They have a thick part like this that goes in first, and that's for security. Then they have a thinner part that goes on top of it that's decorative. We're just putting in this piece. And it's difficult to use a router here because you have the stop. They do make jigs that go on here, and I have them. Don't worry if you go too deep with these. Deep is fine, because you can always just put a little something behind it and shim it out. It helps to get really good at this because you're often doing this the very last thing of the job and you're tired and you want to get out of there. Putting this in for the first time, do one screw only, make it a small screw. Because if this doesn't work, you're gonna have to move it, and you don't want to have burned both holes because it can be very hard to move these things around a tiny bit. Let's see how that works. Nope. It's hitting something. If I bring it toward me, it wants to go in. Even though I did the hole correctly, I didn't put the plate over far enough. So we got to move the plate to the left a little. Okay, so it was right there, but the bolt is hitting right there because it releases once I pull it toward me. The plate has to go right there. So we got our height okay. So see, that's why I didn't want to put in 2 screws, because it can be very hard to get another screw in there. So let's just make this a little bigger.
Now I could have very easily just edited this part out and showed you how it works perfectly the first time. I've been doing this for 15 years and I still make little mistakes like this. This happens and this is how you fix them. And this is why I want to show you the reality of doing this work. It's an easy fix.
Now that allows it to go over more. We put our screw in the bottom and we'll test that. And there. That's what it took. So now we have to put in that second screw. Well, we've got that weird hole in there already. So once again, I would recommend using the centering bit. One more test. Then once you have this thing working with the short screws, they give you longer screws to put in there, either directly in here or in the security plate that goes behind it. And then if you have, messy stuff like this, you just put some filler in there, put some spackle in there, and it'll all look beautiful. Thumb latch works, nothing sticks. Always check it with the keys. Nice and easy. Now there are lots of different locks out there, but they all work on the same basic principles. So just remember, you want to get your bolts in straight. Get your cylinders in there straight. And then let that lock find its happy place. Snug it down. Make sure everything's moving nice and easy. And if it's not, just loosen up screws. Sometimes when a lock sticks, just loosen one screw and then it works. So just back them off a little bit, let the lock find its happy place, then snug it down, and you're good.